Hey, I'm Eric Cunningham of Elections Daily, and welcome to this week's edition of the Map Room. I'm your host, Eric Cunningham, and with me I have Jared and Nick. The last few weeks we've been discussing some important swing states. This week is going to be no different. We're discussing the state of Arizona, located in the Sun Belt, western portion of the United States, a rapidly growing population, generally considered a bellwether of how Donald Trump is going to perform in the suburbs, some areas that he's seen slippage in 2016 and 2018. As you can see from this graph right here, from OddsChecker US, Arizona has actually been considered to be Democratic leaning in terms of the presidential election if you look at the prediction markets. You can see there, starts out with a Trump lead, and now Biden has a lead in the odds checking market. So really important state to look at. So Arizona is an interesting state. Like most Western states, it has a population that's heavily concentrated in urban areas. So it has a lot of rural areas, but the state's biggest population centers are the Phoenix metropolitan area in the center of the state. Then you have Yuma off to the western side. You have Tucson, which is probably the second largest in the state. And then you have a couple scattered ones, like you have Flagstaff, Arizona. You have the Navajo Nation in the northeastern portion of the state, and some other Indian reservations. So this is a very important state to look at. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up a map real quick, and I think Jared can kind of explain the shift that we're seeing here in terms of how the state is looking at certain levels of government. So I'm going to pull up a presidential swing map. So with this map right here, we have the swing of presidential elections in the center, and then off into the right-hand side, we have the different presidential elections. The top, we have 2008, we have 2012 below that, and then we have 2016 below that. And so I'll hand it off to Jared to explain.
Yeah, thanks. So going back to 2008, it was an election between John McCain, who was a native son of Arizona. He was a senator from the state who represented it for many decades in the Senate. And then he had Barack Obama, who, as you all know, won the country resoundingly. But because of McCain's name brand in the state, because of his experience, because of his military history, he appealed to the right crowds. And he won the state by, as you can see, around 9%. So a pretty decent showing for someone in the state. However, it was a decrease from Bush's showing in 2004, where he won the state by over 10%. Going to 2012, as some of the country shifted right because of mild backlash towards Obama and the Tea Party wave of 2010, Mitt Romney performed decently well also in the state. However, because he's not from the state, he did not have the same kind of appeal that John McCain had, but he did decently well in the state. Now, the reason why John McCain and Mitt Romney both did very well in the state was because of the county that Eric mentioned that you see in the center. This is Maricopa County. Maricopa County is not only home to Phoenix, but it's home to its immediate suburbs, which comprise the majority, not just the majority, but the vast majority of Arizona's population. And Tucson is another major city and major hub population in the state. However, it pales in comparison to Maricopa's influence, not only population-wise, but also politically. And so Phoenix in general is a Democratic safe area where Democrats usually perform very well within the city. However, the suburbs are generally very, very Republican. There are various reasons why they perform Republican that we'll talk about later. However, the reason why Maricopa is a solidly Republican county is because of those suburbs. But if you go back to the map, and do you mind pulling up the map again?
Oh, sure. I was gonna show the one of Maricopa, but yeah, I'll go back to the swing map.
Yeah, if you don't mind, we'll go to that one right after.
Yeah.
So before we go to the Maricopa specific map, Donald Trump won the state, but as you can see, Maricopa shifted very heavily to the left from 2012 to 2016. And this is largely because of prevailing overall and national trends that we saw throughout the country, which is that Donald Trump's appeal among suburbanites was very weakened in the 2016 election. And it wasn't the city itself, but it was the surrounding suburbs, many of which are highly educated and are becoming more diverse, that shifted Maricopa to the left. Now, historically, even going back as far as 1948, especially in the election 1964, and going up until 2012, Maricopa voted much to the right of the state. And it was the anchor of Republican politics. Barry Goldwater was from there. And even though he lost resoundingly in the election 1964, he won Arizona because he won the county of Maricopa. But going to 2016, what we started to notice is that Maricopa has started to move to the left of the state. And so instead of becoming the anchor, instead of becoming the bastion of Republican wins in the state, Maricopa is slowly inching to the left in comparison to the statewide margins. And so Maricopa is now moving to the left of the state, and it'll pull the state to the left in national and soon more senatorial and gubernatorial races. If you look at this chart right here, Trump won Maricopa by less than he did the state as a whole. He won 48.2%, rather 48.2%. Clinton won by 45.4%, and so Trump won this county by almost 3%. And this was a major drop from Romney's win in 2012, in which he won the county by over 10%. And now moving on to the Senate race, which I'm sure everyone else can agree is much more indicative of trends that we're going to see in 2020 than even the 2016 race. We saw Sinema win the county by over 4%. And this is remarkable because, again, Maricopa has long been a bastion of GOP politics in the state of Arizona. And the fact that Maricopa voted to the left of the state as a whole is indicative of the fact that Maricopa is going to be driving Arizona to the left in future elections. And so that's sort of the general information that I have, but we'll throw it back to whoever wants, and we'll go more into the specifics later.
Mm-hmm. I'll hand it off to Nick here in a second to kind of explain that Senate election, because that was in many ways a surprising result, and in some other ways it wasn't that surprising. It was a barn burner of a contest. You had two people in Congress, so Martha McSally and Kyrsten Sinema, who were generally considered to be moderates. They weren't necessarily on the friendliest terms, but they were both considered the most moderate members of the delegation. Considering both Democrats in the delegation are very liberal and the other Republicans in the delegation are very conservative. But the other thing is that Arizona is still a Republican-leaning state at the state level, which is kind of why people are looking at this as a bellwether. Both houses of the legislature are run by Republicans, although the House is only Republican by a small two-seat majority. Could easily flip into the next cycle. Republicans have a majority of statewide offices. The governor in the last election won by 15% of the vote. So this is still a state where Republicans can win. It's by no means a state that is gone. But in many ways, it's being looked at because of those strong trending Democratic suburbs in not just in Maricopa, but also in Pinal County. Actually, not Pinal County, Yuma County, which is home to Yuma. Hispanic population is very large there. And then you also have the Tucson area. One thing to notice with Arizona is that the 2012 to 2018 race is that just like underperformed the Republican baseline in 2012, Republicans lost a control of the congressional delegation for the first time since 2008. This was mainly because of a map that was drawn in a way that Democrats had an advantage in a lot of ways. Although Romney won most of a majority of the congressional districts, the two ones that were kind of the median seats, the first and the second district, the first one being ranging from Tocasino and Mojave counties all the way to areas of Maricopa, and one that goes from Cochise to Pena County. They voted for him by only around 2 points when the state voted for him by around 9. So they were 7 points to the left of the state. In the Senate race, you saw another underperformance where Jeff Flake, libertarian-leaning Republican, kind of a rock-ribbed conservative, but not really the most compelling figure, only won by around 3 percentage points against a very credible Democratic candidate, the former Surgeon General, generally seen as a moderate. Ironically, both Arizona and New Mexico in 2012 had competitive Senate races, even as they went fairly comfortably for the other party at the presidential level. And in 2018, as you can see here, Kyrsten Sinema, a moderate House representative from the Maricopa County area, won a Senate race by a small margin against Martha McSally, another moderate House member from the Pima, Tucson area, represented the second district. And so you can see over here in the corner, you can kind of see how the map changed. The big one is that Maricopa County trended considerably Democratic. It trended by about 5 percentage points to the left compared to 2012. But even this was enough to overcome much of the rest of the state turning redder. In fact, in 2012, Jeff Flake had won Maricopa County, but lost the rest of the state, and won the Senate race by around 3 percentage points. The exact opposite happened in 2018, is that Martha McSally won the rest of the state, and Kirsten Sinema won Maricopa, and ended up winning the state by around 3 percentage points. So kind of what it looks like right now is that in many ways, as goes Maricopa, so goes Arizona, is what it kind of seems like in a lot of regards. I'll throw it to Jared here to kind of explain the gubernatorial race, which I think is an interesting counterbalance to the Senate one, because it happened at the exact same time as
Right.
the Senate race.
At the same time of the senatorial race, which is a federal race, you had the chief state race, which is the gubernatorial race. Now, Doug Ducey, the incumbent governor, fairly popular. He's had his dips occasionally, but he was sort of above water at the point of the election. He was running for re-election. He won in 2014 by, as you can see, 53.4% of the vote. And in 2018, he was able to increase that to a comfortable 56% of the vote. And so his opponent, David Garcia, ran a pretty disappointing campaign, didn't really do that much campaigning, didn't appeal to the right kinds of audiences. And so Doug Ducey, rather, was able to win with a very comfortable double-digit margin. But even with that said, you can see that some of the same trends that existed between the 2012 and 2018 senatorial races also were prevalent between the 2014 and 2018 gubernatorial races. And that mainly comes down to Maricopa County. However, before I go into Maricopa, you'll notice that most of the rural counties actually shifted right. And this is, I think, a consequence of extreme political polarization that has motivated counties like Mojave County to shift even further right than they did than had they voted in 2014. Even Pima County with Santa Cruz County, which is heavily Hispanic, they moved slightly to the right just because the Democratic candidate was not incredibly appealing. And then the Navajo and Apache counties in the Northeast, which are heavily Native American, also managed to shift a little bit to the right, mainly because of the faults of the Democratic nominee. But going to Maricopa, Doug Ducey managed to win Maricopa by a very comfortable margin. However, Maricopa again voted to the left of the state. And this is a trend that we saw with the senatorial race as well. And it's concerning for Republicans because Maricopa is the anchor and it's the bastion of GOP success in the state. Now, Doug Ducey managed to win the suburbs by a fairly comfortable margin, not as well as McCain did in 2016, but a little bit better than Trump did in 2016. However, a lot of his success in Maricopa actually came from the more exurban areas. Maricopa is actually more concentrated than it looks like when you look at the actual county lines, because there are some exurban areas that exist with sort of the block-shaped bottom of it, with some of the outlying areas. And so Doug Ducey managed to do pretty well in those areas and to increase his margins there. However, if you take a finer look, a more granular analysis of the suburbs, you will notice that compared to his 2014 performance, he did not do as well.
Mm-hmm. And he didn't underperform by much in Maricopa. He declined, I think, by under a percentage point compared to his 2014 performance. But it is still noteworthy considering he did improve overall. The 2018 cycle as a whole was kind of a disaster for Arizona Republicans. They lost the House delegation. Martha McSally's seat, the 2nd District, which was again heavily centered in Tucson, flipped considerably. It was a Clinton 1 district, and then Ann Kirkpatrick, who was the former representative for the 1st District, moved from Flagstaff to Tucson and easily won the seat. This is another interesting thing with Arizona is that really it does all kind of center on Maricopa. The rest of the state is important. There's a lot of people, but you can easily win the state without Maricopa or without the rest of the state, as long as you win Maricopa by a decent enough margin. It really is the anchor. If you go back to kind of the that map I was showing earlier, the population map, as you can see right there, that big area is all huge population. And then you can kind of see what he was talking about with the exurbs. The green areas are very, very lowly populated. Some of them are Hispanic or even vote more Republican than the rest of the county. I believe you actually wrote an article about this, about a similar phenomenon in Harris County, Texas,
right?
Where the exurbs in that county, another large growing urban county with a substantial growing suburbs as well. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up kind of those examples, the more granular district maps. First, I'll show an example of a congressional district to look at. The 6th congressional district is, I believe, represented by David Schweiker. It's centered in Maricopa County. It's a suburban district. It was drawn as a Republican kind of a vote sink compared to the rest of the county. It's, as you can see, it voted for Donald Trump by 10 percentage points. But in 2018, it only voted for Martha McSally by a little over 2 percentage points, which is a pretty substantial swing compared to, actually, it was 3.3 percentage points compared to 2016, a very substantial drop off. And I don't know if you can kind of see it's all rooted around that portion right over there, which I believe that's which area is that, actually?
That's Scottsdale, essentially.
Yes, Scottsdale.
Is it?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And then this blue area over here is a Native American reservation, actually. So that kind of explains the swing there. So I'll go ahead and show 2 more maps to kind of explain the whole state. So this is Arizona as a whole in 2016. You can see the Native American reservations up in the corner. This area is heavily Democratic. Although in some ways it leans socially conservative on some issues. They're the group of voters that tanked marijuana legalization in Arizona. You can kind of see the Phoenix area is just kind of a big sea of blue at this point. And then some of the other areas around here, like Mason, Gilbert, sorry, not Mason, Mesa and Gilbert are traditional Republican strongholds. Even those are seeing substantial bleed towards the Democratic Party. And of course, you have Yuma over here, which is trending Democratic. You have Tucson, which is trending Democratic. So all around, not great signs if you're a Republican in Arizona. And then we'll show the Senate race as a comparison. You can see Phoenix has gotten even bluer in this one over here. This area around here was light red in 2016. But if you look at it now in 2018, you can see kind of the shift in a lot of Phoenix and in general. One factor in Arizona to keep an eye on is the independent commission that controls how their congressional maps are drawn. Arizona was one of, if not the first state in the country to adopt an independent redistricting commission. And this commission is a 5-member panel, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and 1 independent commissioner. And they collectively decide what the congressional lines and state legislative districts will look like in Arizona for preceding cycles. I am not opposed to independent redistricting commissions, but I find the Arizona one particularly flawed in that it's designed basically to discourage cooperation between parties. Everything that goes on in the commission basically relies on that one independent vote. And so it's much more effective if you can convince the one independent to vote with you in all you want in your party, rather than trying to convince a member of the other party to vote with you. Basically, the independent's power decides what the districts will look like. And in 2010, the independent commissioner was Colleen Mathis. Colleen Mathis was interested above all in competitiveness, which is actually the lowest criteria listed. If you look at the list of criteria that the panel is supposed to consider, competitive districts were actually the lowest. But she determined that it was the most important thing. So after drawing 2 Voting Rights Act districts, the 3rd district and the 7th district, both of which are Hispanic, she realized the rest of the state leans Republican. So her solution was to create the 4th district, which swoops in almost all of the blood red or rural areas. Sweeps in Mojave, La Puz, Yuma, rural parts of all these rural areas, and even Maricopa. And the result is a Republican vote sink represented by Paul Gosar. The 1st district is a mostly rural area. It's one of the largest congressional districts in the country. It has more Native American voters than any district in the country. And as a consequence, even though it has been Republican fairly consistently at the top level, in the presidential level, it has voted for a Democrat all of the elections that it has been contested. Some areas here that have ancestral Democratic strength are Greenlee, which was for a while the most Democratic county in the state. It is now trended, if you remember the Doug Ducey map I showed, Greenlee was one of the counties that trended most to Doug Ducey. And that was because it was very competitive in his first election, which reflected more the traditional Arizona map. And by the 2018, things had changed and it was no longer competitive. The 2nd district is a Democratic trending suburban district, mostly rooted in Tucson. It voted for Hillary Clinton, will not be competitive this cycle. The 9th district was the one represented by Kirsten Sinema, mostly suburban Phoenix area. It was drawn in theory as a swing district, but it has only ever voted for one Republican in its entire existence. So it's not really been that competitive. Then the 8th, the 6th, and the 5th districts are basically the suburbs, the core suburbs of Phoenix. The 5th is rooted in Mesa, Gilbert, basically the two most historically Republican areas in Arizona. The 6th is the northern areas of Phoenix, combined with Scottsdale, some of the rural areas. And then the 8th is in the western part of the county and includes a lot of retirees. It had a competitive race last cycle to a degree, but it's not projected to be competitive. Really, none of these districts should be competitive in 2020, mainly due to the Republican districts being sufficiently Republican to not face most of an issue, and the two competitive districts on paper, 1 and 2, having very strong incumbent Democratic candidates. What will be interesting looking forward in 2020, when a new commission is chosen, is who the independent commissioner will be. Right from the start, people identified that this map was going to be very favorable to the Democratic Party. And the legislative maps are similarly, in many ways, favorable to Democrats, specifically in the use of population deviation. Republican districts have more people in Arizona than Democratic ones do, which Republicans basically accused the commissioners of packing Republicans into precincts so that their vote would be diluted. They've since worked on passing a law that will try to prevent population deviation from being a thing. Typically, you can have a deviation of around 10% from the ideal mean. So the ideal mean is if you take the state's population, divide it by the number of districts, that's the ideal. You can go off of that 5% one direction, 5% the other. The legislature wants to change that to prevent that from happening again. But basically, whoever that independent commissioner will be will have a considerable sway on what Arizona will look like in the future, and will probably be the difference between perhaps a Republican gerrymander or a Democratic gerrymander or a fair map. Either way, that's definitely one thing to keep an eye on for the future. And Jared, I believe, has a map of Arizona that shows two specific districts to keep an eye on.
Okay, so as Eric mentioned, what I did is that I created a very theoretical, hypothetical Arizona with only 2 congressional districts. And the reason why I did this mainly was to highlight the great disparity that exists in population between Maricopa County and the rest of the state. And if you look, this district that I drew here, which is in the light pink, is entirely confined within Maricopa County. And even as some of the suburbs spill over into counties like Pinal County, which is located right here where Casa Grande is, this is entirely confined within Maricopa County. Now, you might be asking what the color scheme represents. I made this color scheme to reflect the margins that Kirsten Sinema and Martha McSally had in these 2 districts. The rest of Phoenix proper is located in the blue district. And along with that, the rest of the state is located in this blue district. And this includes all of Tucson, all of Pima County, which is the second most populous in the state, all of the Native American areas to the northeast, all of the Ruby Red Republican areas to the northwest with Paul Gosar, some of the likely blue, even solid blue areas with the Grand Canyon, the environmentalists up here, and then also places like Yuma County, which have sort of become a little more swingy, but McSally actually did pretty well in the Yuma area. Now, going back to Maricopa County, before I go into some of the demographics, I actually want to show how this compares to past races with these same lines. So I'll pull up a few here. So this is, again, the 2018 Senate performance between McSally and Sinema. If you pull up this map, as you can see right here, which is all red, this was the performance between David Garcia and Doug Ducey in the concurrent 2018 gubernatorial race. And you can see that the Phoenix district, which encompasses Maricopa County, or at least parts of it, is much more red than the rest of the state. But if you go back to 2014, this district that encompasses the rest of the state would probably be a light blue, because Doug Ducey was able to outperform his margins in the more rural areas of the state, and also in places like Pima County, which is more urban. Now, going on, this is the 2016 results. Now, Trump actually did very well in the rural areas compared to some of his performance in Maricopa, but places like Pima County, which went very strongly for Hillary Clinton, and also Yuma County, which just barely won, allowed for the rest of the state to be blue. Now, again, Phoenix is not included in this district, so this district is pretty solidly red. And finally, before I go into some of the demographics, let me go right here. This is John McCain's performance in the concurrent 2016 senatorial race. The rest of the state is light pink, but this really highlights his very strong performance and appeal in the Phoenix suburbs. Now I'll go back. I apologize for this. I'm going to go back and talk about the reason why this constitutes a more Republican district and why we're able to make a Republican district out of this. So as we talked about for a lot of times or on a lot of different occasions, the Arizona GOP is concentrated in these Phoenix suburbs. This has been a stalwart GOP area. It has lifted up people to the statewide level and even sometimes the national level. But this is an area of traditional Republican support. What I want to go over is that this area right here in the light pink actually highlights 3 different coalitions that have traditionally and historically voted Republican that are going to present some major hurdles for Trump in 2020. So going to the west, because I'm going to move from west to east, this area basically overlaps the 8th congressional district. This includes parts of Glendale, Peoria, Surprise, and Sun City. Eric mentioned earlier that this is a highly senior area. There are a lot of retirees here, some of which are snowbirds that migrated from colder areas in the American North and Northeast because Phoenix is very, very warm weather, especially in the summer. You can see that there's an Air Force base here, so there's a bit of a military background here as well. But this is a highly senior area. And so Trump has traditionally performed very well among seniors, and they have voted traditionally very Republican. But based on recent polling nationwide and in various states, Biden is actually gaining on Trump among a lot of people within the senior population. And so seniors are going to be some of the more interesting people to see with how they vote in 2020, because it's highly possible that they either give a reduced margin to Trump or they actually vote for Biden over Trump. And so, again, this is where the 8th congressional district is, represented by Debbie Lesko. And as Eric, I believe, mentioned earlier, this is home to a special election back in 2018. And it started to show some of the cracks in the traditional Republican coalition because Debbie Lesko only won against her opponent, Gerald Cipriani, by around 5%. Now, she managed to win by around 11% in the regular election in 2018, but this is one to watch, not for any time too soon, but in a few generations, it could possibly, with the right conditions, be somewhat competitive. Moving on to this district here. Now, this area, this red area, is actually sort of bisected by the 51 freeway, which runs through the center of Phoenix and its suburbs. And it's basically surrounded by the 101 Beltway, which basically contains the entire suburban region. But anyways, moving on to the 6th district, which is represented by David Schweikert. This includes much of Scottsdale, as you can see here, as well as some of the wealthy areas, including Paradise Valley. Now, as I just mentioned, this is a very, very wealthy region generally. And Paradise Valley is, in fact, the most wealthy region of Arizona as a whole. And even regions like Fountain Hills and going up north to Carefree, these are very wealthy regions. A lot of families that are entrenched in the region have a lot of wealth, and they've managed to make homes here. And just a very, very wealthy region. But especially in Scottsdale, you're seeing a lot of people, not only from Phoenix, but also from neighboring states with very, very high expenses like California, moving into Scottsdale and establishing a younger demographic here. And so there are a lot of new, younger voters who also happen to be more diverse, who are moving into Scottsdale. Some of them are opening up boutique shops and just new businesses in general that sort of conflict with the old guard, traditional people who used to live in Scottsdale. And this is making the region more competitive. And as Eric showed you earlier, the 6th district, which basically contains this region, is represented by David Schweikert, and it only voted for Martha McSally by around 3.3% back in 2018. And so if current polling is correct about Martha McSally's horrible showing against Democratic candidate Mark Kelly, if Martha McSally performs worse here than she did in 2018, which is entirely possible, then it's highly possible that Mark Kelly will actually win the district in his senatorial bid. And so even if down ballot, this is still a Republican district, it's one worth watching because unlike the other districts here, it is one that is very, very precarious for Republicans in that it'll flip more soon than some of the other regions here. Now, finally, moving down to this area right here. This is sort of on the other side of the 101 freeway. This is home to Mesa, Gilbert, and Chandler. And this reveals the third major demographic challenge for Trump, which is the Mormon population. So Mesa and Gilbert and Chandler are home to a very, very large population of Mormons. And Phoenix is actually home, or the Maricopa County region is home to one of the largest Mormon populations in the country, sort of outside of Utah. But Mormons are, as you know, traditionally Republican. They traditionally vote Republican up and down ballot. And this region is represented by Andy Biggs. Andy Biggs is a stalwart conservative. He's now the head of the Freedom Caucus. And this is a traditionally Republican district. But a few minor cracks are beginning to show. Now, this district is more Republican than the 6th and the 8th generally. But because Mormons do not like Trump and his vitriol, because you can see some of them shift, even in other places like Utah, Mormons are going to become less favorable to Trump, especially in the 2020 election. And so this is a district that voted for Trump by around 21%. But I strongly believe that Biden will be able to make inroads within this district just because of Mormon animosity towards Trump and his brand and his rhetoric. And so looking at the grand scale here, you can see that the 8th district, the 6th district, and the 5th district are basically the bastions of the Republican Party in Arizona. And you're able to make a Republican district that encompasses those 3 districts, while also having to feed a little bit into the 7th district, which is urban Phoenix, and the 9th district, which is currently represented by Stanton. It used to be represented by Kirsten Sinema. But because of the challenges that Trump is creating in his demographic prospects with seniors, with wealthy retirees and suburbanites, and also with Mormons, you're going to see that this is going to be a particular challenge to Trump. And if he wants to maintain any sort of success in Arizona, he's going to have to perform very well in this region. But at the current moment, it looks like Trump is going to have a real tough time trying to retain these voters. And Biden, based on his personal brand, based on his appeal factors, he's going to be able to make considerable gains among all these types of voters that constitute this light pink district that I drew over here.
Great analysis, Jared. And that's definitely really concerning for Republicans to be having issues with all 3 of those different major demographic groups in their traditional Republican stronghold area. It's definitely worth looking below the surface at rural, urban, and suburban areas because they don't actually vote uniformly like people think of them. There are a lot of Democratic-leaning rural areas and Republican-leaning suburbs and even urban areas in Arizona, as there are in many states. One race to keep an eye on for 2020 is the Senate election. Martha McSally was appointed to the seat to replace John Kyle, who had been appointed to the Senate following the death of John McCain. John Kyle had no interest in serving an additional Senate term. He had been a former senator, and his time is basically done. He was put in there as a placeholder to just occupy the seat and to continue to serve the citizens of Arizona. The problem is that Martha McSally has not just been performing poorly in the polls against the presumptive Democratic nominee, Mark Kelly. She seems to be at a considerable deficit. So if you can kind of explain the basics of this race, which is one to keep an eye on for control of the Senate.
So if you remember a couple of weeks ago, with regard to the Georgia Senate race, I was talking about how appointed incumbents don't really get an advantage in their races. And this applies to Martha McSally. So the position that Martha McSally is in at the moment is essentially she's running for another open seat. And she's running against another opponent. In 2018, she lost against a candidate who a lot of people thought was a strong recruit in Kirsten Sinema. And then in 2020, the exact same thing is happening. And you've got Mark Kelly, who is a former astronaut, and he's also the husband of Gabby Giffords, who was the representative of the 8th district before she got almost fatally injured in the shooting. In that race, all of the indicators so far are looking good for Kelly. We got a bunch of polls out. I just got a bunch of polls over the last few weeks. So we got a Fox News poll on the 2nd of June that had Biden up 4 points and then Kelly up 13. That is a huge lead. So that's something that McSally has got to be worried about. And and this puts her in a very vulnerable position.
One thing to keep an eye on, or remember about this seat, is that the winner of this seat will have to run again in 2022, which puts it if Mark Kelly is the winner, that kind of puts him in a position where he won't be wanting to vote for a lot of more progressive Democratic priorities like the Green New Deal or any student loan forgiveness, any of these other things. He may be dissuaded from doing that. But regardless, the winner of this, so even if Martha McSally somehow manages to come back from this major deficit, which if she was doing this poorly, she would be losing Maricopa by Joe Arpaio levels of incompetence. She would still have to run in 2022. So it's definitely a seat to keep an eye on. The other one to look at with Arizona, and because the governor and election takes place at off year, is the presidential election. So I've kind of created here a map in 270 to Win, which is a website where you can examine swing states and different electoral maps. So I'm going to go ahead and show what this would look like. So this is kind of what I think a lot of people would say the presidential map looks like right now. I think the Trump team would argue that New Mexico is a toss-up. They are wrong. If the primaries this week were any indication, Democrats outvoted Republicans 60 to 40. But so you can see here, probably Biden has a small lead, although keep in mind some of these states like Michigan is widely considered to lean a little bit Democratic, but it could still vote for a Democrat. Nevada could also be competitive. The performance with Hispanics is a wild card there. Texas, Georgia, Ohio, and Iowa should be to some degree competitive. But Arizona is really the key to all of this. And so let's kind of do an example of how this could actually help Joe Biden. So I'm going to go ahead and make Arizona or Florida and North Carolina blue, or I'm going to make them red. So that's a pretty good spot for Democrat or for Republicans, right? I'm going to go ahead and make Wisconsin red. And then I'm going to go ahead and make Pennsylvania blue. I think this is a pretty likely scenario right here. And then let's say Republicans manage to win Nebraska's congressional district, the one that should be competitive. So with this map right now, you have Democrats at 268, Republicans at 259. Normally, Arizona would be a state you would consider Republicans to be a slam dunk. So this map would be a winner, right? I mean, obviously the electoral vote is close. You could have faithful selectors, but this map would generally be an electoral winner. The problem is Arizona is a toss-up now, and so Democrats could win Arizona and then win the country despite Republicans sweeping Ohio, Iowa, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Florida. These are states you would typically think if a Republican is winning all of these states, they should be winning nationwide. But Arizona kind of throws a wrench into the program, especially if Republicans, for example, don't carry the second congressional district of Nebraska. In that case, it's an electoral tie. That's the nightmare scenario of it, because any individual elector could defect and then result in a swing outcome. But that's one reason why Arizona is so important here, because it is in many ways, it could be the median state. I think most people would say Wisconsin is probably the state that will be closest to the tipping point state. That is the state that is where that's the one where if that state flips, the election flips. Closely behind that would be, in my opinion, Arizona. And it's actually a slightly more valuable electoral prize because it has 11 electoral votes as compared to only 10 for Wisconsin. So definitely a reason to keep an eye out on Arizona in the upcoming presidential election, but also upcoming congressional races. Even though the congressional districts will not be competitive this cycle, new districts will be drawn in 2022. And if there's any indication with the radical renumbering that happened last cycle, a map that was generally kind of irregular in district drawing, the maps could be different in that area too. You could see some of those areas that Republicans are strong in be put in with the areas Democrats are strong. And you could see new competitive districts. And knowing these sorts of trends could help you understand what's happening and maybe be able to capitalize on it. One last thing with Arizona, a good point for Republicans to keep, because even though there's been a lot of doom and gloom talk about Arizona, one thing to keep an eye on is that even though the Republican vote share declined from 2012 to 2016, the Democratic vote share did not grow by much at all. Hillary Clinton went from Barack Obama had 45% of the vote. She had around 45% of the vote. This is a very similar phenomenon the Republican Party has in Minnesota, where the Democratic vote share has consistently declined, but the Republican vote share has been pretty stable at 45%. So even though Democrats won the Senate race in 2018 and performed well locally, we still don't know if they can break past that 45% mark. That's kind of seemed to have been holding them back, because that's where they've been stuck at the last few cycles. If they are able to overcome that, it'll more than likely come from the Maricopa area, would come from Tucson, probably come from Yuma. Lots of areas they could draw additional votes from. And, this is the swing map right here. So this is the map of the last presidential election was right here, over in the corner. And you can see kind of Maricopa is red, Yuma is red, Navajo, all these areas are still red to some degree.
So when you're looking at the 2020 election, one of the reasons why Democrats are so bullish on it is because of the trends that we were talking about. But it's also of note that Republicans have had traditional success because they have incredibly high turnout in places like the 8th, 6th, and 5th congressional districts, while turnout is very anemic in districts like the 7th, which is in urban Phoenix. However, as we see in Texas with Biden's not wonderful performance among Hispanics, it's the white educated suburbanites that are really going to bring this election home for Democrats if they're able to do so. And so it's not going to be urban Phoenix that you're going to need to watch to see if Democrats are going to win it. It's going to be reduced margins for Republicans in those suburban regions that we talked about, increased margins for Democrats in the 2nd congressional district, which is in suburban Tucson. It's areas like that where Democrats are going to need to make inroads to win. And so even though Hispanic turnout might be depressed, as we're seeing from polling in Nevada and in Texas and in Arizona even, it's going to be those, again, suburban, white, college-educated, even women to that extent, who are going to decide the election. So even though Arizona does have opportunity to remain swinging in the near future, I personally do believe that Biden is going to have a very, very good shot. And in fact, he has a majority chance to win Arizona just because of those trends. But that's not to say that Republicans are completely done in Arizona. If you look in 2022, especially with the Democratic administration, especially with the trifecta, if we see that in 2020, keep an eye out, because Republicans are going to be able to, at least in some ways, make some sort of comebacks in some of the regions that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. It's definitely a state to keep an eye on. It's going to be very important going forward. Democrats have been consistently making gains in the Western United States for over 40 years now. If you look at the presidential and local results, states like Washington, Oregon, California, Nevada have all trended Democratic, and it appears that Arizona is trending the same. But we'll keep an eye on 2020, see what happens. Definitely a state to pay attention to. And with that, I think we'll go ahead and wrap up this week's edition of the Map Room. I'd like to thank Jared and Nick for being here. Go ahead and say your social media, where you can be found.
Yeah, so my Twitter handle is @JStonePolitics. Feel free to look it up, access, and I'm always there. So I'm happy to help out in any way I can.
Yeah, same here. My Twitter handle is TossUpReport. Yeah, I'll be there, and in case anyone wants to ask some questions, my DMs are open. If anyone wants to send me a message regarding any of those sorts of things.
Yeah, and you can find me at DE Cunningham 2 on Twitter, at DE Cunningham 2, and you can also find our writings at Elections Daily. We post there fairly often. So with that, I think we'll wrap up this week's edition of the Map Room. Thanks everyone for watching, and we'll see you again next week.